Okay, well, thank you very much and good afternoon. It is still afternoon in California. I'm in Philadelphia, so a little different time zone. But thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'll try to keep my comments as brief as I can to allow for time for questions. Having served on a commission, I know what it's like when you have the panel testimony and you're anxious to ask a question or two and you have to kind of wait till the end. So I'll do the best I can in trying to keep it short. My name is Chuck Ramsey. My background is in policing. I started my policing career. I'm a native Chicagoan. I began my policing career in Chicago in 1968 as a police cadet. I spent 30 years as a member of the Chicago Police Department. I left in 1998 to become police chief in Washington, D.C., where I served for nearly 9 years, retired very briefly, and then took on Philadelphia, where I served as police commissioner for 8 years. It was mentioned early on during the introductions that in 2015, I had the honor of serving as co-chair of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, which came about in the aftermath of Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown and Eric Gardner in New York. President Obama at the time wanted to have a in-depth review of policing with solid concrete recommendations. And we did produce a document with some 92 action steps, 61 recommendations, which many departments are using to this day. But to focus on narcotics, if I may, drugs. I do have a background in drug enforcement. When I served in the Chicago Police Department as a sergeant, I was a member of the narcotics section from roughly 1978 to 1984. So about 6 years I served in that capacity. I returned to that unit and was reassigned there in 1991 or so as the commander of Organized Crime Division Narcotics Section. So most of my street experience with narcotics comes from my time in the Chicago Police Department, although obviously Philadelphia and DC had more than a share of issues surrounding crime. So this so-called war on drugs, I was one of the people that actually was assigned to narcotics during that period of time. Obviously, the so-called war failed. It failed on a lot of different levels. But primarily, in my opinion, it failed because there was nothing really provided for treatment and prevention. Everything was geared toward enforcement. And that was pretty much the mandate, get the drugs off the street. When crack cocaine hit in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s in Chicago, there was a great deal of violence that was associated with open air drug trafficking. And so that just amped things up a bit in terms of enforcement activity. But again, there was very little done in the area of treatment or prevention. I also think that this whole, the legislation that was passed, and again, I'm not familiar with California law. I can only address laws in the cities where I worked. But that disparity in crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine, at the time they did it, many of us in narcotics didn't understand why. I mean, it's all cocaine. It's just a different form of cocaine. And we didn't understand the need to pass that kind of legislation, but it was passed, and it did lead to a disproportionate number and lengthy incarceration of primarily people of color. So again, there were a lot of things that went wrong. There's absolutely no question about that during that period of time. And fortunately, I think there are some things that are being done to try at least to correct some of that. When I served as co-chair of the task force, we addressed 6 specific areas, and we limited it to 6 because the president, he wanted a report on his desk within a relatively short period of time. We had some 45 days or so in order to actually sit down and actually work on the report. We had, by the way, it wasn't just a law enforcement project. We had civil rights attorneys. We had people that had just come off the protest lines in both Ferguson and New York that were part of this. We did have law enforcement. We had constitutional lawyers. We had a variety of people, 11 in total, that made up the task force. We were able to reach consensus on every single recommendation that you'll find in that report. Despite our varied backgrounds, we were able to come up with the recommendations in which we all agreed were needed in order to improve policing. The very first thing we tackled was building trust and legitimacy, and it was mentioned earlier when going through the history of policing. And policing has a very, very bad history, especially as it relates to people of color. There's no question about that. But the people we're hiring today weren't alive during some of that. I mean, I'm 72 years old. I remember the actual civil rights movement of the 60s and so forth. We aren't hiring 72-year-old cops. We're hiring 20 and 21-year-old cops. So it's very important that that history be incorporated in training, because people need to understand, officers need to understand in their specific cities, whether you're talking San Diego, Philadelphia, Chicago, or Washington, D.C., what's the history of policing in that particular city, especially as it relates to communities of color. And I think if we're going to make any progress moving forward, that's a very important part of what needs to be done. Certainly, there have been some changes in terms of legislation and sentencing and those kinds of things, but not enough is being done, because we do need to focus on reentry. We do need to focus on treatment and prevention. We do need to focus on housing and substance abuse, addiction, and all those kinds of things if we really want to turn the situation we have around in terms of crime on the streets of our city, some of which is drug driven, but a lot of it isn't drug driven. So we have a variety of areas that we need to really aggressively go after in the sense of trying to turn it around, trying to change people's lives. And everything doesn't have to be with arrest and incarceration. We need alternatives to incarceration. They need to be fully funded so that there is options available other than just jail, because many people do not belong in jail. But there does need to be some kind of consequence for their action, but it doesn't have to be incarceration. There are, of course, others that commit more serious crimes that do need to be incarcerated, in my opinion. But that's not the majority. The majority of people, I think we can find alternatives. But they have to get serious about the funding that's needed if we're ever going to get beyond this cycle of having discussions around these issues. And then, 2 or 3 years later, we have a discussion pretty much like the one we had before, because nothing really changes. And it's not going to change unless we make it change. So I'm going to end there, because I think it's important, and I'm sure there's some questions, not only for me, but other panelists as well. But thanks again for inviting me, and any questions you have, I'm more than happy to answer.